Let me begin by asking you to cast your minds back, if you will, to the year 597. Now, though you don't immediately recognise the date, let me explain that in the year 597, a remarkable event occurred in the history of this nation. In that year, if you had been on the Isle of Thanet, which is apparently off the coast of Kent, it's the place that everybody who was visiting this island in those days seems to have arrived at, you would have seen a remarkable meeting of men. There were, on the one hand, 40 odd-looking people dressed in cowls and gowns, with their heads shaven, chanting in Latin, calling themselves monks, 40 of them, and on the other hand a king sitting in the open air on a throne. Now, those of you who don't know may well be asking what this was all about, and the answer is that in that year Ethelbert, King of Kent, king of the Kentish men actually, had agreed to allow these monks to come to England and to tell him about Christianity. He'd heard a little about Christianity because his wife was Christian, and no doubt they had the odd occasional conversation. Well, a busy kingly life, you never know. In any event, he did allow these monks to arrive, and he insisted on sitting in the open air because he was a bit worried about them practicing witchcraft on him, quite rightly so in my view. And he then just simply sat there and waited to see what would happen. Quite an interesting event. Now, these monks approached him walking up a hill. He was on top of a hill. That would also prevent them from practicing any witchcraft on him. They had a cross, a silver cross in front of them. They had a Christ crucified. I suppose if you know nothing about Christianity, that's a splendid introduction to it, isn't it? It's a great big picture of Christ crucified. And chanting this language which he didn't understand. Now, I don't know if any of you were introduced to Christianity in that way, but it was probably an event which impressed itself on Ethelbert's mind, if nothing else. And in fact, we know it did, because he allowed Saint Augustine, whose name at the time was just Augustine. You could only be a saint if you're dead. Did you know that? He allowed him to preach the word of God. Bede, our historian of the period, says that he preached the word of life. And having heard it, Ethelbert said to Augustine that he was impressed by the fair promises which Augustine had made to him, whatever they were, and that he would allow him to preach to his people, which is quite remarkable acceptance in a way. He himself said, I can't accept Christianity at the present because I can't just overthrow the religion of my forefathers, the traditions of my nation. But you can preach to whosoever you want, and you can convert them if you wish. He himself was converted, in fact, in about a year's time. Now, why is that event so important? That's the question. And really, the question that it seems to provoke is why the Christians, the Christian mission which had been sent by Pope Gregory, was keen to speak to Ethelbert at all. And having done so, what precisely were they keen to impress upon him? What were they trying to do? Now, we happen to have, because Bede got hold of it, sitting in his monastery in Jarrow, near Newcastle, a letter written by Gregory, who inspired that mission, to Ethelbert of Kent. So we have a sort of window into exactly what was going on. This is an actual letter. Bede tells us that one of his many underlings, a chap called Nothelm, had gone all the way to Rome to get it, and that he'd got it out of the archives of the popes, and that it was there in front of him as he wrote his history of the English people, ecclesiastical history of the English nation. And so we actually have the letter that Gregory the Great, Pope, sent to Ethelbert, king of the Kentish people. And I'm just going to read it to you, if you'll bear with me a moment. He says, "To our excellent son, the most glorious King Ethelbert, king of the English, the Bishop Gregory. The reason why Almighty God raises good men to govern nations is that through them he may bestow the gifts of his mercy on all whom they rule. We know that this is so in the case of the English nation, over whom you reign so gloriously, so that by means of the good gifts that God grants to you, he may bless your people as well. Therefore, my illustrious son, zealously foster the grace that God has given you, and press on with the task of extending the Christian faith among the people committed to your charge. Make their conversion your first concern. Suppress the worship of idols and destroy their shrines. Raise the moral standards of your subjects by your own innocence of life, encouraging, warning, persuading, correcting, and showing them an example by your good deeds. God will most surely grant you his rewards in heaven if you faithfully proclaim his name and truth upon earth. And he whose honour you seek and uphold among your peoples will make your own name glorious to posterity." Now, what you will notice is a very ancient tradition being introduced to England at that very moment. What Gregory is saying to Ethelbert is that the way you exercise your rule is important. It will influence the salvation of your people. It's no good any longer just being a king, whatever that meant. You also now have to set an example. You have to be a good king. And the reason is that the salvation of your subjects depends on it. Now, behind that is a very powerful idea. It's the idea that the whole of society is somehow bound together, and that the way authority is exercised in that society affects the whole society. Now, in fact, this has been known in the West since, I suppose, the time of Plato, and before that, although it was first expressed by Plato. And in Plato's Republic, or rather Socrates, in the words of Plato, in the words of Socrates, in that work, he expresses this precise view. He says that justice is basically, on an individual scale, justice is the exercise of reason in the soul. All the harmonious ordering of the soul by the use of reason is justice. In a state that is the exercise of good rule by the king, the philosopher king. Now, his words precisely are these. He says, until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, and those commoner natures who pursue either to the exclusion of the other are compelled to stand aside, cities will never have rest from their evils. No, nor the human races, I believe. And then only will this our state have a possibility of life and behold the light of day. In no other state can there be happiness, private or public. So what you need is a philosopher king. In other words, you need someone at the pinnacle of authority who is also wise. To rule others, you must rule yourself, in other words. The great Hellenic adjunct, the great statement on the portals of the Delphic Oracle, know thyself, coming here through the teaching of Plato, that in order to govern others, you must govern yourself. You must rule yourself. And that's precisely what Gregory the Great is saying to Ethelbert, king of the Anglo-Saxons. Now, whether the Anglo-Saxons knew this beforehand or not, I don't know. the only evidence we have about what Anglo-Saxons believed before Christianity arrived is a little bit dated, I'm afraid. It goes back to Tacitus, who's writing about the Germanic tribes in the 1st century. And nevertheless, he does say this about it, which is worth hearing. He says, "They do not, however, deem it consistent with the divine majesty to imprison their gods within walls or represent them with anything like human features. Their holy places are the woods and groves, and they call by the name of God that hidden presence which is seen only by the eye of reverence." So we don't want to diminish or demean what it was the Anglo-Saxons actually believed before Christianity arrived, but the simple fact is that it had obviously waned, its influence was in decline, and perhaps that's because of the migration. In case you don't know, and this may be a shock to some people, I hope not, but the Anglo-Saxons, that is the people who lived here from the 5th century onwards, came from Europe. They were a collection of peoples, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. In fact, we're only called English by pure mistake on Gregory the Great's part, actually. Writing to Ethelbert, he described him as King of the Angles, which is just a mistake. He thought that all the English people, all the people living in the island of Britain, were Angles, but in fact they weren't. The Angles lived in the north, and he'd only met people who lived in the north. He'd met some slave boys being sold in the marketplace of Rome, and being a Roman, he thought it was just like it was in Roman times. It was a Roman province, and therefore there were Angles. Angle means a corner. Tacitus described the Germanic people that came to this country as Angles because they lived in a corner of Europe, tucked away. But Gregory thought it came from the Greek agelos, meaning heavenly messenger, angels. And so he thought it was an appropriate name to call them, and that's why we're called English, in case you didn't know. We lived in a little corner. Or we're derived from the heavenly messengers, whichever you please. In any case, their migration to this country probably dislocated their worship, and it must have lost a great deal, whatever it was. It obviously goes back into the mists of time, and far be it from deride whatever it was. Nevertheless, they're certainly receptive to Christianity. Ethelbert says to St. Augustine, he says, "You can preach to my people. Fair are the promises you bring. And you look sincere, and anyway, you've come a long way." And they had indeed come a long way, all the way from Rome. Now, that meeting on that island of Thanet is the first introduction into England of this concept of self-rule, a Platonic concept, the concept of the philosopher king. Now, how does it get into Christianity is the question. And I think the answer lies, well, obviously, in the 6 centuries that Christianity has had to develop within the classical world. It obviously lies in that. The fact that educated Christians used as sources of their education the literature available to the ancients, the great classics of Greece and Rome. Obviously it's going to come in that way, but more especially it comes in, I believe, in the work of a man called Ambrose. Now, those of you who don't know who Ambrose was, let me just briefly explain. He was Bishop of Milan in the late 4th century. I knew that would enlighten you. He's one of the 4 Latin doctors, the 4 fathers of the Western Church, along with Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. And he had a slight problem. His problem was known as Theodosius the Great. Now, the Emperor Theodosius was a very powerful man indeed, the last great emperor, really, the last emperor of both East and West. Quite a handful, if you're an emperor, to rule the entire Roman Empire as it stood in about the year 390. Very difficult, not recommended. In fact, Theodosius knew it was impossible and divided his empire up into four, in fact, 2 emperors and 2 Caesars upon his deathbed. But he had the power and the strength to govern the entire show. That gives you a measure of how great he was. At that time, barbarian hordes were beginning to encroach upon the Roman Empire, and he managed to keep them at bay for some time. In fact, they never defeated him. Now, Theodosius was a Christian. In the 4th century, the Roman emperors had become Christian. Now, for 4 centuries, well, for 3 centuries, it's about 310 that they become Christian. For 3 centuries, Christianity is an outlawed sect. You're not allowed to be Christian. Those that were risked great penalties and often suffered as a result. The emperors were at least hostile from time to time, at best merely ambivalent. The founder of Christianity, after all, had died as a criminal convicted by a Roman court. So obviously it's an outlawed, dangerous sect as far as the Roman emperors are concerned. All that changes all of a sudden. But until then, Christianity had no way of treating kings. As far as they were concerned, a king was something that you had to put up with, basically. Christ had said, render to Caesar the things of Caesar, and render to God the things of God. There's a clear distinction. You have to live in this world, and you give to Caesar what belongs to him, but your soul belongs to God, and that's really where you should put your attention. That's a very, in a sense, negative way of living for 3 centuries, and it led to a great deal of persecution. Constantine changes all that. He suddenly decides to become Christian. He has a vision before a battle at Milvian Bridge. He sees in the sky a great sign, and even the words to go with it, saying, hoc in signes vinces, I think, something like that, isn't it? In this sign is victory. And the sign was the Greek initials of Christ. So he thought, well, that's a good omen. I'll try it out. He asked all his soldiers to put those initials on their helmets, and lo and behold, he won the battle and consequently became a Christian. After all, if Christianity can do that for you, why not? Now, having become emperor, he ruled an empire that was 90% non-Christian. He's Christian, and his chief advisors are Christian, but the empire itself is not. The chief worship was the worship of Mithras. Jolly good worship if you're interested in sunbathing. Mithras was the god of the sun, represented by the sun, and there's quite a few Mithras worshippers around these days. This was a predominant worship in the Roman Empire, and indeed Constantine had to adapt Christianity to fit it. I hope this isn't too much of a shock to you to say that December the 25th was actually the great feast day of Mithras, and he merely grafted on the nativity of Christ. I'm not saying that in any disrespectful way, because of course once you've decided to commemorate the nativity of Christ on that day, then you sanctify it in that way. But nevertheless, he was merely adapting to circumstances. Ditto Sunday. Christianity up to that time had shunned the Sabbath. That was a Jewish event that you didn't have anything to do with. They didn't believe in it. Sunday, Day of the Sun, this is when everyone went to the temples and worshipped Mithras. Well, we'll adopt that and we'll invent a new Sabbath, namely Sunday. And so Constantine was very clever. And he became a stalwart Christian. Now that led to problems because the Roman emperor was also treated as a god in the Roman Empire, so you've got something of a problem here. And indeed, Constantine's successors were less careful than he was to keep the church pleased, and they tended to behave as if they were gods, which meant sitting on councils and telling the bishops how they should worship. My word is canon law, said Constantius, successor of Constantine. What I say is law for the church because I'm a Roman emperor. I'm a god. What I say goes. You probably know a few people like that. Anyway, Theodosius, who follows in this tradition, therefore, this is only 70 years after Constantine, Theodosius the Great, has this rather peculiar position to fill. He's treated as a god by his subjects, but he's also a very pious Christian, and the two don't really mix. Now, it's up to the church to teach him this. And this is where the philosophy of Plato and the Hellenic tradition, and indeed the Roman tradition, because the Roman philosophers, Cicero, Seneca, they're following in the path that Plato trod. Their Stoic philosophy says exactly the same as Plato, that the ruler himself must rule himself in order to be of benefit to his subjects. Now, how is that going to get across to Theodosius? Well, in fact, it gets across through a bit of trouble that the Bishop of Milan has with Theodosius. Ambrose lives in the same city as Theodosius, Milan. The emperor's moved from Rome to Milan. In fact, he kept moving about at this stage, but Milan is where he resides in the reign of Theodosius. And he's got a very obstreperous bishop on his doorstep. Ambrose was no ordinary man. He was, firstly, he was a senator of the highest rank. His father had been prefect of Gaul. He himself had been governor of two northern Italian provinces, Liguria and Emilia are their names. And he hadn't intended, he was a Christian, there were many Christians in the empire at this stage, he hadn't intended becoming a bishop. He was in charge of these northern Italian provinces when the Bishop of Milan died. Now, there was enormous trouble choosing his successor. The way the successor was chosen was everyone went to the cathedral and elected a new bishop. But there was enormous trouble because they couldn't agree on who the next bishop should be. Ambrose went to the cathedral in his capacity as governor to quell the burgeoning riot. He stormed into the cathedral to restore order. He was a well-respected figure, and he was unanimously and spontaneously elected bishop, much to his disgust. But he appealed to the emperor, Valentinian, who duly put the seal of approval on the election. So he's now a bishop. Quite a surprise if that happens to you. I don't know if anyone's been in that position, but it must be fairly difficult, I would have thought, walking into a cathedral as an armed governor of a province with all your soldiers around you, and suddenly walking out as a bishop. Well, in fact, in the late 4th century, which is where we are, if you remember, it wasn't such a big change. The bishops were respected men in their communities, learned, and quite powerful as well. And he's an ideal choice because he can face up to the most powerful of men. And indeed he does so, and does so consistently. There's a lovely episode when the Grand Chamberlain of Valentinian, he gives Valentinian a hard time, by the way, Ambrose. Valentinian is only a 12-year-old boy, and he does tend to make mistakes. One of which is thinking that he's omnipotent. And Ambrose chastises him, much to Valentinian's mother's disgust. And he tells him to behave himself. And the Grand Chamberlain, greeting Ambrose in the consistory at Milan, in the imperial court, says to him, "Would you insult my emperor? I will have your head." And he puts his hand on the helm of his sword. And Ambrose, cool as a cucumber, says, "And I will suffer as befits a bishop, and you will act as befits a eunuch." there's not a lot you can say to that. And in fact, the Grand Chamberlain disappears from history. And quite right. You can imagine him sort of scurrying off the pages with a blush on his face. So this is who Theodosius faces. Now, Theodosius also made mistakes, and one of them was to, as it were, in a fit of pique, to massacre 7,000 people. Now, you and I have fits of pique, but you're emperor of both East and West, and you've got barbarian hordes pressing at your borders. A fit of pique tends to resound across the centuries. And what happened was, very simply, one of his garrisons at a place called Thessalonica, which is in Greece, was giving the locals trouble. The Greeks considered themselves as more superior to the Romans, and this group of Roman soldiers in the garrison were behaving like louts. After all, they were barbarians. We think of barbarians as being people who invaded the Roman Empire. The Greeks thought of barbarians as being the Romans. And they took the opportunity one day for disposing of the captain of the garrison. They killed him. Now, I know that wasn't a very sensible thing to do, but the retribution was quite horrendous. Theodosius decided to massacre the entire town. And he waited until they were all attending the circus, all the men, and then he sent the troops in, locked the doors and sent the troops in. Several hours later, the troops emerged, and 7,000 corpses littered the circus. So you can imagine the number of widows and orphans that left behind in Thessalonica. Not a very pleasant aspect to Theodosius' rule. Anyway, Ambrose was, like most right-thinking people at the time, shocked by this. All right, as an emperor, you have to demonstrate that you're in charge, I suppose. And Theodosius did a good job. He's gone down in the pages of history as being a man who kept good order, good justice. And indeed, in Christian history, he's considered to be, with Constantine, the second great emperor. But Ambrose said to him, wrote him a letter and said, he'd gone on visits to South Italy, he said, don't return to Milan, don't return to the cathedral here to celebrate Mass, because if you do, I cannot serve at the altar. Not until you have repented of your sin. Now, if we can just backtrack a moment, bear in mind, the emperor is still considered to be a god by his subjects. It's true that Theodosius' immediate predecessor, but one, Gratian, had renounced the title of Pontifex Maximus. He was no longer, he said, in charge of religion. But nevertheless, the people and the way the emperor himself behaved was as if he was divine. And here he was being told by a bishop that he was not going to be able to celebrate Mass, which for a Christian emperor, of course, is crucial, unless he repented of his sins. So the message is going home that he is a man. He's a mortal creature. Not only that, but he can sin. And if he sins, then he's got to repent. Simple as that. Well, Theodosius was not at all pleased by this, as you can imagine. But in the end, Ambrose had his way, and Theodosius did public penance for that crime, the sin of killing those 7,000 souls. And that's the first time in Western history that any sovereign has acknowledged an authority greater than his own. It's certainly the first time in Western history that a bishop has exercised such a powerful influence on a monarch. Now, Ambrose, in doing that, used the philosophy that he was familiar with, which is basically Platonic. And in case there's any doubt about that, I'll read you one or two things he said, if you bear with me. I won't read you all this, don't worry. about half of it. Firstly, this is what he says in a work called Hexameron. He says, if I can find it, here we are. Because Christ is of the same substance as God and lives in the heart of man, by knowing himself, a man comes to the divine essence. Attend to thyself, therefore. Know thyself. Attend to your soul and mind, whence all our deliberations emanate, and to which the profit of your works is referred. Here only is the fullness of wisdom, the plenitude of piety and justice of which God speaks. For all virtue comes from God. And he goes on, God found repose in the deep recesses of man, in man's mind and purpose. For he had made man with the power of reasoning, an imitator of himself, a striver after virtue, and one eager for heavenly grace. Ditto, this is from a work called De Isaac vel Anima, on Isaac or the soul. Therefore know yourself and the beauty of your nature. Can't get more simple than that, can you? And this is direct Platonic philosophy, the philosophy of the knowledge of the true self of man. Now, it comes to Ambrose through a variety of routes, but the main one being his priest, his confessor, a man called Simplicianus, who was a famous Platonic philosopher in Milan. And it spreads from Ambrose to St. Augustine, who's converted by Ambrose and is something of a Neoplatonist. From Ambrose onwards, it tends to become narrow and defined. Origen, who's the great Christian Platonist from Alexandria, is in fact condemned in the year 400 by the Church, which is just shortly after this. But they were always rather ambivalent to Platonic philosophy because it was deep in their thinking. It was the substance, the sort of coinage of the classical world. And it certainly provided Ambrose with a scheme for fitting the Roman emperor into Christianity. Basically, he has to be the philosopher king. It's as simple as that. He's not a god, he's a philosopher king. And Plato describes the king as being among the second of the 7 levels of being. Quite close to divinity, but not. And in Plato, you have this hierarchy of being. Every soul is immortal and is striving for perfection. But the degree to which he has attained that perfection determines where he stands on the hierarchy of being. It's as simple as that. So you don't have any conflict between having an emperor who is a philosopher king and a subject who is also immortal in essence, and God who is immanent, all transcending. There's a unified concept in Plato whereby each soul seeks liberation and attains perfection through the use of reason. And that's how it comes into Christianity, basically. It's a ready-made system for incorporating a Roman emperor into society, when they hadn't really thought about it before because they hadn't had to. Now, it comes across as I've described when Gregory the Great preaches to the Anglo-Saxons and tells them that the way you exercise your kingship matters to the whole of society. Do it properly, do it well. And it spawns a great tradition, certainly in this country and in Europe, which I'll just briefly allude to. Most people have heard of Alfred the Great, the only king of this nation to be called the Great. And he is, to all intents and purposes, the epitome of the philosopher king. He knows that he must, in order to govern his people properly, govern himself, and he says as much. And indeed his actions prove that he understands the meaning of those words. Lucky I didn't read you all that, isn't it? he had certain books translated, and one of them was the Great's Pastoral Care. And it's no coincidence he goes to Gregory the Great, and he selects the Pastoral Care, which is written by Gregory for his bishops. And it's a treatise describing how bishops should behave towards their flocks. But of course it was in fact a universal treatise applying to any person in authority, and it was treated as such by subsequent commentators. And this is what Gregory the Great wrote. Very often the manifold cares of assumed leadership trouble the heart, and when the mind is divided between many things at once, it is less firmly fixed in each case, and also less effective. Concerning this, the wise Solomon said, "My son, do not dissipate your mind on too many things." And the same is true of your labours. For it often happens, this is Gregory again, that when a man loses the awe and constancy which he ought to have within him, his mind tempts him to a great many useless activities. He is anxious about them, preoccupied with them, and forgets himself when he sets his mind on these useless activities far more than he ought. I'm sure we'd all agree on that. And that is from Alfred's translation. So Alfred the king is reading Gregory the Great and translating it for the benefit of his people. He also translated this from St. Augustine's Soliloquies. There is no doubt that souls are immortal. Believe your own reason, and believe Christ, the Son of God, and believe all his saints, because they were very reliable witnesses, and believe your own soul, which through its own reason tells you continually that it is within you. Abandon now your unjustifiable doubt. It is sufficiently clear that you are eternal and shall exist forever. Now, that is actually Alfred's own words, because he says he's translating St. Augustine's Soliloquies, but that passage does not occur in St. Augustine's Soliloquies. He's, as it were, become lyrical, inspired perhaps, and added this to the end of Book 2. And it's quite a remarkable statement. The soul is immortal, and know that to be within you. So here's a philosopher king, all right. There's no question about that. And this is what he says about governing. I think that's probably where we're at the moment. He says, and without the tools to govern, one cannot do any of the things it's charged to do. For that reason, I desired material to rule that dominion with, that my powers and dominion would not be forgotten and concealed. For every talent and every dominion is soon worn out and silently passed over, if it is without wisdom. For no man can bring forth any craft without wisdom, for whatever is done in folly can never be accounted as a craft. So I have to rule with wisdom. And clearly this is something he knows and he's been taught. And he's been taught through Christianity. There's no limitation here on philosophy. Christianity incorporates all this great wisdom of the ancients. Christianity spread in England and reached Northumbria, where a number of great kings reigned: Edwin, Oswald, Oswiu, Egfrith, Aldfrith. Now there's a man. I'm sure we all remember Aldfrith. Well, you probably don't, but Aldfrith was actually a very, very remarkable man. He was a learned man, probably the most learned king that's ever sat on a throne in England. And you've never heard of him. Never mind. He wrote poetry. He communicated with the Pope on equal terms. Aldfrith had received a tremendous education. The only trouble is he tended to preside over a kingdom in decline. Northumbria was wiped out shortly afterwards by the Vikings. I suppose he probably had too much learning and not enough wisdom, actually. Because, of course, what Alfred's doing is very, very practical, isn't it? I'm reminded of Henry I, who the Peterborough Chronicle describes Henry I as a lion of justice. And it goes on to say, feared by both man and beast. That's the sort of justice I like. I mean, if you're going to be king, you've got to do the job, haven't you? But wisdom, with this practical edge to it, nevertheless seems to, well, obviously it restrains any excess in the leader. And Alfred is unique among kings, as far as I can make out, in having no predilection towards unnecessary violence, shall we put it that way. It's very difficult to find anything bad about Alfred. The most you can come up with is that in the year 886, when he conquered London, he was fighting Englishmen, not Vikings. But I mean, these were merchants who were keen on Mercian independence rather than uniting to fight the Danes. He's a remarkable man, Alfred, and of course it's from him that the culture that we enjoy, the language that we express these thoughts in, has survived. Now, shortly after the conversion, well, let's say 597, 690, about 200 years actually, a Northumbrian called Alcuin was filched by the court of the Carolingians and went to become an advisor to Charlemagne, king of the Franks, emperor indeed, after the year 800. And Alcuin said this to one of Charlemagne's sons: "Your most noble devoutness is not unaware how we are exhorted throughout all the pages of Holy Scripture to the learning of wisdom, and that nothing ranks more highly in the attainment of a happy life, nothing provides more enjoyment to engage in, nothing affords greater strength against failings, and nothing is more praiseworthy in any dignitary. According to the pronouncements of the philosophers also, there is nothing more necessary to the ruling of a people, nothing more favourable to the ordering of a life lived in the best fashion than the splendour which is wisdom, the renown which is knowledge, the virtue which is learning." That's being preached to a son of Charlemagne, and Alcuin was Charlemagne's chief advisor. So you can see that this wisdom, which is contained in the philosophy that the church taught to monarchs in this period, which is usually called the Dark Ages, spread right across Europe. Alcuin was a Northumbrian, an Anglo-Saxon, and I think that teaching, which he derived from his study in York, is what arrives when Gregory the Great preaches to the Anglo-Saxons, preaches to Ethelbert of Kent in that fateful year 597. Now, of course, all this, just to sort of summarise, if you like, is looking at the nature of authority. How much of your freedom do you give to those in authority? How much do you retain? All these questions have exercised the minds of men and women for centuries, throughout history, really, haven't they? And the answer that always arose in these times, at least those times I've been talking about, was that if your ruler was wise and knew himself, then the whole of society would benefit. That was the key. Whether that's relevant to John Major's back to basics policy or not, I leave you to decide. But I think I'll leave it there for the moment, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them after we've had some refreshments. Thank you.